שלום לכולם, אחר הצהריים טובים, תודה לכל מי שהתחבר ושמחים להתחיל את הוובינר שלנו. אנחנו רגע לפני שנתחיל ואני אעביר את הבמה לדוברים המכובדים שיש לנו היום, שני דברים טכניים, רק housekeeping, אחד לומר שהוובינר הזה מוקלט, אנחנו נעלה את ההקלטה הזו יחד עם הצגות של הדוברים ומידע נוסף לעמוד אינטרנט יהודי שהקמנו, כך לא צריך לצלם את המסך. דבר שני, שאנחנו נקיים סשן של דברי פתיחה יחסית קצר, ואחר כך נעבור לפאנל המכובד שלנו, שנציג אותו בהמשך, ומשם והלאה אנחנו נעבור לשפה האנגלית. ודבר אחרון, שאנחנו בסוף הוובינר נקיים כרבע שעה פאנל של שאלות ותשובות. אני מזמינה אתכם להשתמש ב-questions and answers ולרשום שאלות דרך משם, אם ניתן אז רצוי באנגלית. זהו, without further ado, אני שמחה להזמין את מר אוהד כהן, מינהל סחר חוץ. להציג כמה דברים.
שלום לכולם. המשבר המצער שפוקד את אירופה על רקע האירועים האחרונים, אינו פוסח גם על כלכלת ישראל ועל יחסי הסחר שלנו עם העולם. מינהל סחר חוץ בראשותי הקים חדר מצב יהודי עבור חברות הישראליות הפועלות בקשרים עסקיים עם השוק הרוסי וגם עם האוקראיני, על מנת לייצר מענה ממוקד לאתגרים השונים העולים מהשטח. אנחנו נרשום בצ'אט את כתובת המייל, ואתם מוזמנים לפנות אלינו בשאלות כאלה ואחרות. מאז למעשה תחילת האירועים המלחמתיים, הופעלו סנקציות כלכליות נרחבות על רוסיה, ולכן במטרה להנגיש לחברות הישראליות מידע מקיף ועדכני בנושא, אנחנו ארגנו את הוובינר של היום, ואני גם רוצה להודות לדוברים הנכבדים משני משרדי עורכי הדין שלנו, באל בליס ואייקין גאמפ האמריקאי, שנרתמו למשימה בלוח זמנים קצר ביותר. חברות ישראליות שפועלות בשווקים בינלאומיים צריכות להיות מודעות לסנקציות שהוטלו על רוסיה ובלרוס על ידי מדינות שונות, וביניהן ארצות הברית והאיחוד האירופי. חלק מאותן סנקציות עשויות להיות רלוונטיות לחברות הישראלית, ולכן חברה ישראלית שמבקשת לסחור עם גורמים פרטיים או ממשלתיים ברוסיה ובלרוס, צריכה לקחת בחשבון מספר נקודות שתהיה להם התייחסות בסמינר, כגון האם למשל הגורמים המעורבים בעסקה והגורם עמו מבקשים לסחור, גורם המימון של העסקה או אמצעי השילוח, נמצאים ברשימת הגורמים שמופעלים נגדם סנקציות. לבדוק מול הבנק בישראל את היכולת לבצע העברת כספים עם גורמים ברוסיה ובלרוס. בכלל, אנחנו ממליצים מאוד להתייעץ עם גורם מומחה בנושא, דוגמת משרד עורכי דין, על מנת להבין אם ואיך לבצע את העסקה המתוכננת. זה יכול לחסוך הרבה מאוד דברים בהמשך. כמו כן, אנחנו מבהירים כי מלבד ארצות הברית והאיחוד האירופי, יש מדינות נוספות שהטילו סנקציות, ויש גם חברות שנקטו בצעדים באופן וולונטרי, כחלק מהמדיניות התאגידית שלהם, וכדאי לשים לכך לב. בנוסף, חשוב לציין כי כחלק מהסנקציות, גם מחלקת הסחר האמריקאית הרחיבה את תחולות כללי הפיקוח על הייצוא האמריקאים. עמיתי אופיר גור, מנהל האגף על הפיקוח על הייצוא, יתייחס לזה בהמשך. כמו כן, אנחנו רוצים להבהיר שהסנקציות עלולות להחריף ככל שימשך המצב באוקראינה, ושמשכך, המידע שיש לנו בוובינר הזה עשוי להשתנות בהתאם, ואנחנו מאוד ממליצים לעקוב אחרי המידע המתפרסם בנושא, וגם באתרים שלנו, של מינהל סחר חוץ. ופה יש לי הערה מהלשכה המשפטית, חשוב לנו להדגיש כי משרד הכלכלה והתעשייה מציע את המידע בוובינר כשירות לציבור למטרות כלליות ואינפורמטיביות בלבד, והוובינר אינו בא להחליף ייעוץ מקצועי, האחריות היא על החברות לפעול בהתאם לשיקול דעתן המקצועי ובכפוף לכל דין. זה היה דיסקליימר, בשביל שאף אחד לא ייקח אותנו אחר כך לבית משפט בגין מידע כזה או אחר. אני רוצה לסיים רק להודות ללנה זייגר ותמר מירון, שעבדו מאוד קשה על קיום הוובינר הזה, אז תודה רבה לנה. Our colleagues from Aiken Gump and from Van Bael, thank you so much for taking part in this webinar. We appreciate your availability in a very short notice, so much appreciated. Lena, I'm forwarding it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, תודה רבה ועד, וכעת אני מזמינה את אופיר גור, מנהל מינהל היהלומים והפיקוח על הייצור הדו-שימושי.
אז תודה רבה לנה, והמון תודה גם אוהד על הדברים. אחר צהריים טובים לכולם. אני מקווה שהוובינר היום יתרום להבנה והיכרות של הסנקציות החדשות והנושאים הקשורים לכללי פיקוח על הייצוא של ארצות הברית ומדינות האיחוד האירופי. קודם כל, כשאנחנו מדברים על הסנקציות ועל כללי הפיקוח על הייצוא, חשוב לזכור שיש מדינות שמכילות את הפיקוח שלהן מחוץ לגבולותיהן, כלומר יש לחקיקה שלהן תחולה אקס-טריטוריאלית. המשמעות היא שגם אם מדובר בפעילות עסקית שמתבצעת על ידי חברה מחוץ לגבולות המדינה, יש מקרים בהם החברה המקומית נדרשת לקבל רישיון או אישור ממדינה זרה, וזאת בנוסף לחובותיה כלפי חוקי המדינה שלה. לדוגמה למדינה שיש לה פיקוח אקס-טריטוריאלי כזה היא ארצות הברית, כלומר חברות ישראליות עשויות להיות כפופות לפיקוח אמריקאי, גם אם כל הפעילות שלהן מתבצעת בישראל. לכן חשוב מאוד להיות מודעים לזה ולבחון את הקריטריונים שקובעים האם פעילות החברה שלכם כפופה לחוק האמריקאי. לאור עיקרון זה חשוב לי להדגיש שני נושאים מרכזיים שלדעתי יסייעו לחברות ישראליות להיערך לקראת סביבה בינלאומית משתנה. המונח הראשון שאני מאמין שחשוב מאוד להכיר, להבין ולזכור הוא Internal Compliance Program. ניתן לתרגם את זה לתוכנית ציות פנימית של החברה, ומדובר בעצם בהליכי בקרה פנימיים. יותר ויותר חברות בישראל ומחוצה לה החלו לאמץ הליכי בקרה שונים, שנועדו להבטיח שפעילותן עומדת בכל דרישות החוק, ואינה מפרה את מחויבות החברה לפי כל הדינים שחלים על פעילותה. דוגמאות לדינים שחלים על פעילות העסקית של החברות, עשויות להיות חוקיות הייצוא, איסור הלבנת הון ועוד. תוכנית הציות הפנימית צריכה להיבנות באופן ייחודי לכל חברה, כך שתוכל לענות על הצרכים והדרישות החוקיות שחלות עליה. יש מדינות שמחייבות את החברות שעוסקות בייצוא מפוקח ליישם תוכנית ציות פנימית, כתנאי הכרחי לקבלת סוגים מסוימים של רישיונות ייצוא. מבחינתנו, האגף לפיקוח על הייצוא במשרד הכלכלה והתעשייה, לא קיימת חובה חוקתית לאמץ את התוכנית על מנת לקבל רישיונות ייצוא, אבל לא מעט חברות עושות את המהלך הזה באופן וולונטרי. באתר שלנו ניתן למצוא מדריך לבניית תוכנית לציות פנימי שיכול לסייע לחברות שמעוניינות לעצב ולאמץ תוכנית משלהן. מונח נוסף שחשוב להכיר הוא Know Your Client, KYC, או בעברית הכר את הלקוח שלך. חשוב מאוד שחברות העוסקות בייצוא מפוקח יאמצו תהליכי בדיקה של הלקוחות שלהם לפני ביצוע העסקאות. עיקרון זה בא להבטיח שיצואן יבחן את העסקה ואת הלקוח שלו כדי לעמוד בחובות הרגולטוריות החלות עליו ולמנוע עשיית עסקים עם גורמים שנמצאים תחת סנקציות או שהמסחר איתם מוגבל. השיטות לבחינת הלקוחות הן מגוונות ובין היתר יכולות לכלול חיפוש אקטיבי של המידע בנוגע ללקוח, בדיקה יזומה ברשימת הסנקציות השונות, העברת שאלוני מידע ללקוחות פוטנציאליים שכוללים שאלות אודות זהות, עיסוק והפעילות העסקית של הלקוח. תשומת לב מיוחדת נדרשת בנוגע ללקוחות שהבדיקה בעניינם מעלה דגלים אדומים. הדגלים האדומים יכולים להיות קשורים לאי אפשרות של היצואן לוודא את זהות הלקוח, שלא ניתן מידע מספק בנוגע לפעילות ולשימושים האפשריים במוצרים, חוסר התאמה בין המוצר המיוצא לפעילות הרגילה של הלקוח, קיום חשד שמטרת העסקה היא לא זו שהוצרה על ידי הלקוח וכו'. אני מאמין שהדברים הכי חשובים שכולנו צריכים לקחת מהוובינר היום הם בחינה מעמיקה של שרשרת האספקה שלכם, אימוץ תוכנית ציות פנימית שתכלול בדיקות מעמיקות של הלקוחות שלכם, והליכי בקרה נאותים על פעילות של ייצוא מפוקח. אני מאחל לכולנו אירוע מוצלח, תודה.
תודה רבה אופיר. So we will switch to English at this stage and till the end of the webinar. So thanks again to our distinguished guests from Washington DC and Brussels. We will start with the presentation of the EU and shortly UK sanctions. So that I would like to present our guests and experts from the Bael Bellis firm. Bael Bellis is a leading independent law firm based in Brussels, with offices also in Geneva and London. Bael Bellis has developed a reputation as one of the most skillful teams of lawyers with focused expertise in EU law and international trade law. The firm has extensive and expert control and assists foreign private entities in the assessment of the impact on their business activities of sanctions imposed by various governments and international organizations. And today we have two experts with us. Isabel Van Dam is a partner at Bael Bellis. She specializes in EU law and international trade law. She assists clients with matters involving compliance with export control legislation and UN, EU, and national sanctions. And she previously worked at the Court of Justice of the European Union, where she worked on several high-profile sanction cases. Aldo Scalini is a counsel at Bael Bellis as well, and he specializes in EU law with a particular focus on trade law. He has extensive experience in assisting public bodies and individuals affected by EU sanctions. And he also advises clients with trade. And Isabel and Aldo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will now share the presentation, Isabel.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Lena, for that very kind introduction. So Aldo and I will cover the EU sanctions. I will first speak about the sanctions against Russia and talk a little bit about the MFN issue. And then Aldo will continue with talking about the Belarus sanctions, highlighting some of the differences between the EU and UK sanctions, and then talking more about the risk assessment that Israeli companies must undertake because they might kind of suffer some compliance risks because of these EU sanctions. So the start of our presentation is, of course, the question, who must comply with these EU sanctions? That's probably the first question that you ask yourself. Well, of course, EU sanctions inherently have an effect on trade on non-EU countries. In essence, this is a foreign policy tool. And even in the event that you do not have a particular compliance risk with the sanctions, nonetheless, there will be an impact on the supply chains of your goods and services, especially as a result of the various packages that have been adopted so far. Now, one point we want to stress, and this will come up a few times during our presentation, is that EU sanctions only apply if there is some link with the European Union. And I'll explain what that actually means in practice. So you must have a link with the EU. There is no extraterritoriality in the strict sense, but watch out, because the obligations that are attached to the sanctions also apply if, for example, an EU national or an entity are acting outside the European Union. So when do these sanctions apply? Well, first of all, they apply if there is a territorial link. So any conduct in the European Union is subject to the sanctions. And that's then the territory of the EU member state. Second, it's EU nationals that must comply with the sanctions. So this means nationals of the EU member states. And even, as I said, if they are outside the European Union. So if you have in Israel an EU employee, that employee will have to comply with the sanctions. The third category are the entities that are incorporated or constituted under the law of an EU member state. Again, it doesn't matter whether or not they are present in the EU. The mere fact of incorporation into an EU member state is sufficient. This also means that, for example, branches of EU companies in third countries can be affected by the sanctions. Then the sanctions apply to any entity in respect of any business that you do in whole or in part in the European Union. So if you are an Israeli business and you're doing business partly in the EU, then you must also respect the sanctions. And then finally, of course, the sanctions also apply in respect of kind of any aircraft or vessel that falls under EU member state jurisdiction. So what does this mean? This means that EU member state nationals and companies must comply with these sanctions, regardless of where they are acting, inside the EU or outside the EU. But you can already see, based on these 5 criteria, that also non-EU companies and persons might incur certain compliance risks, depending on how your supply chain is structured and where, for example, your business activities are focused. So against that background, we want to stress again that, as you can see, there must always be some kind of link with the EU, and there is no strict extraterritoriality that applies under EU sanctions. So what does that mean for Israeli nationals and also businesses? Do you need to comply with EU sanctions? Well, at least already in a few instances, it becomes clear that compliance is required. That's the case, for example, for EU-Israeli dual nationals, for EU employees of Israeli companies, as I already mentioned, and also for EU branches or subsidiaries of Israeli companies. And then finally, as I mentioned in respect of the previous slide, basically any business that you are doing in the EU is affected by the sanctions. This could mean because you, for example, hold a bank account in the European Union from which you do certain transactions, or even you undertake payments that go via intermediary bank in the European Union on its way to Russia. That would be sufficient to fall within the scope of the sanctions. So while there is no strict extraterritoriality, the scope is nonetheless broad. So what are then these new EU sanctions against Russia? Of course, there were already sanctions in place since 2014, but now we've had several sanctions packages during the last few weeks. And in essence, if you think about EU sanctions, there are three main categories of sanctions. There are what we call the targeted sanctions, and they affect people and entities that are specifically listed. And then we'll see that there are also financial sanctions and trade sanctions, or what we could also refer to as export control. So the first thing you always want to do is actually check in your supply chain if you have any contact association or any link with any of the listed entities or persons. And you will find at the end of our PowerPoint presentation that we will share with you a list where you can actually check whether any person or entity in Russia with which you're dealing is in fact listed. From the moment you find that you have such a link, there are immediately three obligations that kick in. The first consequence of the fact that someone is listed or a company is listed is that the assets and the funds and economic resources belonging to these entities need to be frozen. And this is actually an obligation that has far-reaching consequences and a very broad scope. The word funds is very broadly understood to include cash, deposits, dividends, shares, stocks. And the word economic resources, you must understand it as meaning that anything that you give in terms of service or good or in any other matter, anything that you give to a listed entity that results in an economic benefit for that entity, that will be an economic resource. So not only do the funds and economic resources of these listed people and entities need to be frozen, it is also prohibited from making any funds or economic resources available to these entities. And that's the absolute starting point. There are some derogations that are available, but they're rather limited. Some of them apply, for example, for professional services, and it is absolutely required to first obtain an authorization from an EU member state before you would, for example, transfer any funds to a listed entity. I should note that as a matter of EU law, we refer to authorizations, but you can also understand it as meaning, in essence, that you need a license to, for example, transmit certain funds to a listed entity. And then finally, of course, for any listed individuals, there is a travel ban. So that's kind of what applies in case you have any connection with any listed entity. Aldo, if you could go back to maybe our first sanction.
My mistake, sorry.
No worries. So to go back to actually financial sanctions are the second category, as I said, and I think, yes, thank you very much, Aldo.
Sorry.
So what's very new about kind of these new Russia sanctions is the broad set of financial sanctions that apply. And broadly, you can consider them in 6 different categories. The first one is the so-called SWIFT exclusion. SWIFT is this interbank messaging system that is administered by SWIFT, which is actually a Belgian company. So of course, as a Belgian company, it must comply with all the EU sanctions. For the moment, the SWIFT exclusion is still limited to certain banks, but we expect that this list most likely will be extended. So if you already are making payments via these banks or to accounts held on these banks, you might already be incurring certain difficulties as a result of the SWIFT exclusion. Second type of financial sanction are restrictions on transactions involving any Russian corporate debt and securities. This is again quite wide, and since yesterday, it now also includes certain sanctions in respect of crypto assets, because there was, of course, concern that this sanction would be circumvented through the use of cryptocurrencies, and the EU is currently updating these types of restrictions. Then third, there are also restrictions on transactions involving Russian sovereign debt, reserves, and assets. The fourth category of financial sanctions relates to restrictions on the supply of certain financial services. It basically means that in the European Union, an EU national, or also outside the EU, an EU national cannot receive deposits over 100,000 euros from any Russian entity or person established or resident in Russia. This restriction applies regardless of whether or not the entity of person is listed, is subject also to targeted sanctions. The fifth category involves, and this is entirely new, a prohibition on participating in Russian sovereign wealth fund projects. In essence, if you have any type of participation, direct or indirect, in a project in which also the Russian Direct Investment Fund participates directly or indirectly, this should be a red flag, and this should be looked at much more closely. We're still awaiting guidance from the Commission on what specifically co-financed will mean and how far we should interpret this prohibition. And then finally, there's also under the financial sanctions, an important prohibition on exchanging euro-denominated banknotes. Apart from these kind of 6 broad categories of financial sanctions, there are also very significant trade restrictions that apply. And so far, in respect of Russia, the European Union has not imposed any import restrictions. For the moment, they are all export restrictions, and that's important to keep in mind. But we note that it could be that in the next few days, certain types of import restrictions will be added. And in essence, we're dealing now with 5 large categories of export restrictions. First of all, we have an export ban on certain oil refining goods and technologies. Second, we have an export ban relating to the aviation sector. Third, we have an export ban on all dual-use goods and technology. Fifth, we have an export ban on semiconductors, cutting-edge technologies, and any other goods that basically can contribute to Russia's military and technological enhancement. And as you can see on our slides, since last night, we also have an export ban on maritime navigation goods, which is rather wide and does not specify, for example, that the use of the goods must be for the Russian military. It could even include certain vessels. So that's a latest development. There are a few points to make in respect of these export controls or export bans. The first thing is that it's not sufficient to merely check whether or not you could be affected by the export itself that occurs. Basically, if you have any other involvement in the sale or the supply of these products, that could also trigger a compliance risk. And also, the bans are not limited to only goods and technology. It also includes software and various types of services that are given or supplied in relation to these goods. And if you want to know more about what are then these specific goods that fall under these export bans, there is each time a very long annex attached to the regulation that lists these goods. And some of these annexes are constantly being updated. There are some derogations and carve-outs, and this is here where you can talk about the idea of applying for an export license. So on the one hand, there are certain kind of carve-outs in the sense that certain things are excluded from the prohibition. But there are also derogations, and it's an important distinction. Because if it's a carve-out, you don't need to apply for any type of export license. If it's a derogation of different source, you do need to apply for an export license. And you apply at the member state customs authorities or relevant competent authorities for the export license. You don't go to the Commission in Brussels. You have to go to the member states. So there are certain derogations and carve-outs, and that's of course now very much the focus for many affected entities to see if they can make use of these derogations and carve-outs. Next slide, please. Then finally, there are a few other restrictions that we don't want to touch on in detail because they might not affect your businesses. Of course, if you have any goods that are in your supply chain that somehow originate from Donetsk and Lugansk, there are significant sanctions in place in respect of those goods and also services. And then there's certain other restrictions that were adopted, such as, for example, the fact that Russian planes can no longer use the EU airspace. Before I turn to Aldo to talk more about the Belarus and UK sanctions and the risk management, I nonetheless wanted to add one point about MFN status. This is something that you might be reading about a lot in the papers these days, because it seems that, for example, Canada and the US are moving further and faster in respect of this issue than the EU. So MFN basically means that so far as things stand, the EU should treat, for example, Russia no less favorably than it treats, for example, exports of goods to, let's say, Israel, or imports of goods from Russia or Israel. And there are certain MFN duty rates that apply. And currently the EU is contemplating of removing MFN status. What this would mean is that, in essence, there would no longer be this obligation to give Russian goods or Russian services the same treatment as, for example, the EU gives to Israeli goods and services. What it also would mean in practice for probably many of your supply chains, if you have any of your goods, for example, that you source from the EU, but contain certain parts or components that were made in Russia, it could be that suddenly the goods that you source from the EU become much more expensive because higher duties might be applied by the EU. This is something that is an ongoing development, but we do anticipate some action of the EU in that front in the next few days. And I'll now kind of hand over to Aldo for the Belarus sanctions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. So let's now move on to the new subject. As you may know, the EU also adopted new sanctions against Belarus. In essence, those sanctions mirror the sanctions already applied and against Russia by the EU. So also in the case of Belarus, there are targeted sanctions. Without reiterating what Isabel already explained, target sanctions basically address individuals and entities whose names are included in a list, and they are subject to asset freeze, prohibition to make funds, economic resources available, and travel ban, only applying to individuals, of course. Also, with regard to Belarus, there are trade restrictions. So export ban on dual-use items, software, and technology, and the related services. Also, in this case, there are carve-outs and derogations. So in some instances, it is necessary to apply for a license before the competent national authorities of the EU member states. In other case, simply some goods are excluded from the export ban. Additional trade restrictions, though, have been adopted against Belarus after the Russian aggression, and they concern specific goods, products of wood, cement, iron and steel, rubber, and machinery. In this case, we have an import ban, so direct or indirect imports into the EU of these products coming from Belarus are prohibited. It's also prohibited the transport in any country of these goods, the purchase, direct or indirect, and all the related services. So operators in the EU cannot provide any service, for instance, technical assistance, brokering services, financial services, or assistance concerning the import or the export of those goods. Yesterday, the EU Council also adopted new sanctions against Belarus. First of all, financial restrictions. A prohibition concerning the transactions with the Central Bank of Belarus related to the management of reserves and assets has been adopted, so aligning those sanctions with the sanctions already applied against Russia. There is also prohibition of the listing and provision of services in relation to shares of Belarus state-owned entities. There is a significant limitation of the financial inflows from Belarus to the EU. Also in this case, a prohibition concerning the selling and exchange of euro-denominated securities and banknotes has been adopted. Another new measure adopted against Belarus concerns SWIFT exclusion. So also in the case of Belarus, we have 5 banks, which are listed here in our slide 16, which are then excluded from the SWIFT network. That means that it is not possible to transfer money via SWIFT to those banks. Let's now briefly touch upon the sanctions adopted by the UK. As you may know, the UK adopted sanctions against Russia and Belarus, against Russia since Brexit, basically, just implemented the sanctions in place in the EU since 2014. So there were already sanctions against Russia, indeed. After the last events concerning Ukraine, the UK adopted new sanctions in the form of targeted sanctions. These sanctions basically mirror the sanctions already adopted by the EU. So there is a list of entities and natural persons subject to assets freeze, travel ban, and prohibition to make funds and other economic resources available to them. There is an element, a new measure, which is different from what the EU already adopted, consisting in shipping sanctions. In the case of the UK, ships owned, controlled, chartered, and operated by a person connected to Russia, and also ships flying the flag of Russia or registered in Russia are prohibited from entering UK ports and may be subject to detention. There is one thing to note concerning the UK sanction. Although there is a lot of coordination between the EU and the UK in this matter, so some of the sanctions are basically the same, this does not mean that they are identical. So we advise Israeli operators to always check the relevant regulations before concluding any transactions involving the UK and Russian entities. This is very important because in some cases, for instance, concerning derogations or carve-outs, there may be some differences between the EU sanctions and the UK sanctions. Let's now turn to the compliance risk for Israeli companies. In this slide, we just summarized what are the main points to be checked by Israeli operators. As Isabel explained earlier, there is no extraterritoriality concerning the EU sanctions, but this does not mean that operators outside the EU may be affected by the sanctions. So first of all, what to do? First of all, always ask yourselves, are listed persons or entities involved in the transactions? What banks are involved? What goods and services are you providing? And what is the use, or who are the users of the goods and services which are the subject of the transaction? It's evidently very important to understand and assess if there is any link, nexus, any touch point with the EU and Russia. As explained before, it's always necessary to have a double link with the EU and then with Russia or Belarus, of course, in order for the EU sanction to apply. So in this case, you should check your touch points with the EU and Russia, and in particular, you should be aware of the investors and shareholders of your customers, for instance, or of your contractual counterparty. What are the banks involved and used for the payments concerning your transaction? The direct and indirect customers. An example may be your customer is not listed, of course, but is controlled or owned by a listed individual. For instance, in this case, there might be a high risk. Goods and services sourced from or provided to Russia. So all these items, all these elements should be carefully checked before concluding any economic transaction involving EU and Russian entities. Another important thing to do is to stay updated. EU sanctions against Russia and Belarus will change rapidly depending on the security developments, political developments. So it is very important to stay informed of any communication from the relevant authorities at EU level, if possible, also at the member states level. So always check the official journal of the Union and the relevant website. We will have a list at the end of our presentation with some useful links where you can find useful information, and always screen Russian counterparties against the updated EU sanction list. This is updated, every time the council, adopts a new sanction. So it's important to check the consolidated list of individuals and entities who are subject to the sanctions. Finally, we would like to draw your attention to some possible scenarios entailing a high-risk situation. We just represented here 3 examples. Of course, there may be several scenarios that may arise from the transactions between EU operators and Israeli operators. A first example may be the case of an Israeli company transferring funds directly or indirectly to a non-designated entity, so an entity which is not in the list, which is though owned or controlled by a Russian listed person. And this payment takes place from the territory of the Union, so via EU banks. In this case, of course, EU sanctions would apply. It is important, though, to understand what is the control. So to define the term control, the determining factor is whether the listed entity is able to assert a decisive influence over the conduct of the other entity. For instance, if there is the power to appoint or remove a majority of shareholders or the members of the boards of directors, to influence the corporate strategy, the decision of the company, in that case, there will be control. So if you have a counterparty which is not listed but is controlled by a listed entity, that may be a problem. So EU sanctions in that case will cover this scenario. A second example would be the case of an Israeli company making payments to accounts held by the listed Russian banks via SWIFT. As said, the Union adopted a SWIFT restriction. Now, since SWIFT is a Belgian company, and as such, it is bound to comply with EU sanctions, no matter where its members are located, this transaction is simply prohibited. So irrespective of the fact that the operator is located outside or inside the Union. So this also applies to Israeli operators. Finally, there is another scenario which is important in our view, and is the scenario where an Israeli operator can act as an intermediate company. For instance, in the case of an Israeli company reselling tech products manufactured by a non-designated company, which can be located outside the EU and outside Russia, for instance, which is though controlled by a Russian listed person to the EU. So this transaction, this resale to the EU takes place, and the goods or services, I mean, the goods involved are manufactured by a non-designated entity controlled by a Russian listed entity. In this case, the EU sanctions will apply. Why? Because some payments are involved in this transaction. Of course, the Israeli company will pay the relevant supplier, so the entity controlled by the Russian listed person. The EU operator will pay the company in exchange of the goods, so the company in Israel. And according to the Council, this entails an indirect transfer of funds to the listed person. So as long as the manufacturer of the goods is controlled by a Russian listed person, the transaction between the Israeli company and the EU operator ultimately amounts to making funds and economic resources indirectly available to that listed person. So you should watch out and be very careful when there are goods coming from Russia, or where, there are goods simply manufactured in Russia, which are traded with EU operators. As said, we also have at the end of our presentation a list of websites and other sources, which we invite you to check constantly, especially the consolidated list of person groups and entities subject to EU sanctions. It's very important to be updated. I will now leave the floor to Isabel for the conclusions.
Thank you very much, Aldo. I think we've probably taken already enough of our time, so we're very grateful for your attention, and we now look forward to hearing more about the US sanctions and then also to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much from our side here from Israel, Isabel and Aldo. This was very, very good. And I'm glad to present our next two speakers. They are from Eking-Gump, Strauss, Howard, and Feld. Eking-Gump is an international law firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. and with offices around the globe. Their international trade practice is comprised of more than 75 attorneys and professional staffed in offices around the world and serving clients on a wide range of export controls, economic sanctions, customs, trade policy, and other trade laws and regulations. And we have today with us Kevin Wolf. Kevin is a partner in Aiken's Washington, D.C. office. He's a former senior U.S. Department of Commerce official, and he served 7 years as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration. And we're also joined by Andrew Schlossberg. Andrew is a counsel in Aiken's Washington, D.C. office, and he advises U.S. international clients on a wide range of international trade laws and regulations, specializing in U.S. economic sanctions. Kevin and Andrew, thank you.
Great. Thanks for asking us to speak. The issue with U.S. Export controls and sanctions, which Andrew and I will each address separately, is that they apply not just to transactions from the United States or exports from the United States or transactions involving U.S. persons, but particularly the export controls are quite extraterritorial, meaning that they apply outside the United States, even to wholly non-U.S. origin items and transactions. So Andrew is going to go through and describe the current status, which are evolving almost daily, of sanctions that were imposed as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then I will describe the export controls, the difference being sanctions primarily deal with issues involving money and transactions and U.S. persons, and export controls tend to deal mostly with physical items, software, and technology. So Andrew, all yours on sanctions.
Great, thank you. Shalom, everyone. I'm Andrew Schlossberg, I'm a counsel in the International Trade Group. So just at a high level, as Isabel already discussed, sanctions are a tool of foreign policy. They're an alternative to military force. There are restrictions imposed by governments and multilateral organizations against countries, territories, entities, and individuals. They restrict transactions and dealings, very similar to what we've seen in the EU and UK context. And as is the case with Russia, countries may impose countermeasures in response to sanctions. And this is sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but Russia has imposed a number of countermeasures in response to US measures. And that's sort of something else we're monitoring as well. In the US, we have different types of sanctions programs. The first are comprehensively sanctioned programs. They essentially prohibit nearly all unlicensed activities and transactions involving targeted countries and jurisdictions. So in the US, that means that US persons can't, absent a license from the government, can't deal with Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Crimea, and the DNR and LNR regions of Ukraine. So comprehensively sanctioned, no dealings absent a license whatsoever in these jurisdictions. The next type is list-based sanctions program. So, dealings with certain designated individuals and entities are prohibited. In the US, the main sanctions list, which you've probably heard about, is the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control's SDN list, especially designated nationals and blocked persons list. If you're on this list, US persons are generally prohibited from all dealings absent a license. The property, interest and property of the SDNs are blocked, essentially frozen. And the restrictions don't just apply to the listed entity, but any entity that they own by 50% or more, directly or indirectly. That's what's called the 50% rule. So if you're on the list, US persons can't deal with you, but even if anything you own 50% or more of, even if it's not listed, US persons are subject to the same restrictions. So it's quite a broad, when OFAC puts someone on the SDN list, it's a very broad sanction. It's very consequential. And so just want to make sure we understood that. We also have more limited sectoral or hybrid sanctions programs. These prohibit certain unlicensed activities and transactions with designated entities in specified sectors. So we actually saw this in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. The US imposed restrictions in certain Russian sectors. It wasn't broad blocking SDN restrictions like I just discussed, but it involves certain more limited restrictions on certain types of companies in certain Russian sectors. And then importantly, this is a key distinction from the EU and UK presentation. The US has secondary sanctions. These are extraterritorial sanctions on non-US persons that engage in prohibited conduct that are deemed contrary to U.S. foreign policy or national security. So even if there's no U.S. nexus at all to the transaction, the U.S. can say, if you're dealing with a sanctioned person, we'll actually sanction you. And so we'll get more into secondary sanctions in a bit, but that's a key distinction between the U.S. and the EU and UK, this concept of secondary sanctions. And so, who do U.S. sanctions apply to? U.S. persons are any U.S. citizens worldwide, any U.S. permanent residents, any entities organized under U.S. law, including foreign branches, any person in the United States. And so you can see the various different ways that U.S. government authorities can assert what we call primary sanctions jurisdiction, even outside of the U.S. This means that civil monetary penalties can be imposed. Jurisdiction could not just U.S. person involvement anywhere worldwide, but any U.S. dollar transactions that indicate U.S. bank involvement. So even if you're in Israel and you're dealing with a counterparty in U.S. dollars, the U.S. can essentially say we have jurisdiction over this transaction because of the use of U.S. dollars. It's quite broad, and folks outside of the U.S. don't. It basically has to do with how important the U.S. dollar is to the global financial system. OFAC has asserted before jurisdiction over purely non-U.S. conduct that just involves the use of U.S. dollars. That's it. And also, there are other different ways that the U.S. can assert primary sanctions jurisdiction over someone, even if extraterritorially, even if it's just involving non-U.S. parties. So we're seeing expanded ways of this. There was some cases about emails through U.S. servers, making bankruptcy or other filings in the U.S. The U.S. government is really taking some creative ways to assert U.S. jurisdiction in recent years, not just if there are U.S. persons or U.S. goods or U.S. dollars involved. And then secondary sanctions, I briefly touched on this, but these are laws and executive orders that the U.S. government imposes on non-U.S. persons just because they deem it contrary to U.S. Foreign policy. So, if the U.S. wants to impose secondary sanctions on someone, they can say, we'll put you on the SDN list because you're dealing with someone who we already put on the SDN list. And it's very discretionary. And even if you meet the terms of the statute or the regulation, the U.S. government will sometimes warn you before imposing secondary sanctions. And so it's a bit of a difficult type of restriction to explain, but it's something that applies to U.S. persons, non-U.S. persons, pretty broadly across various programs, not just Russia, but Iran, North Korea, et cetera. So just moving on to Russia, I mean, yes, there have been lots of sanctions recently, and we'll get into that, but U.S. sanctions on Russia have been imposed for the last 8 years, essentially, starting with the Magnitsky Act, which authorized blocking sanctions against certain individuals for human rights violations. As I mentioned before, in 2014, the U.S. imposed a wide range of sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, which included a comprehensive embargo of Crimea. In the last couple of years, we've seen more sanctions. Some of you may recall in 2018, OFAC designated a number of Russian oligarchs and the companies that they own. So this was Oleg Deripaska, Viktor Vekselberg, a lot of Deripaska and Vekselberg's interests. And so that was back in 2018. Just the U.S. has essentially broadened out its sanctions program, not just for Russia's actions in Ukraine, but also other harmful foreign activities that Russia has engaged in throughout the world. And so all of the stuff that's on this slide are actions that the U.S. imposed before last month on Russia. And so by no means is the Russia program new, but as we're about to dive into, the U.S. has significantly expanded the scope and breadth and depth of the Russia program. And so just getting to that a little bit, this all started, as our EU and UK colleagues discussed, this started a couple of weeks ago when President Putin recognized the DNR and LNR as independent states. So a couple of days later, President Biden issued this new executive order imposing comprehensive sanctions on the LNR and DNR regions of Ukraine. So U.S. persons are broadly prohibited from dealing with that region absent a license. And then the next day, OFAC essentially started imposing what they call swift and severe sanctions once the invasion began. So this was blocking sanctions on very large Russian banks, VEB, PSB, prohibitions on dealings in sovereign debt in the secondary market, only if they were issued after March 1st. Then we saw prohibitions or blocking sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline operator and its CEO. These were happening day by day. Essentially, each day was a new sanction. And then on the 24th, significant sanctions. The original scope of this from the U.S. perspective was targeting the Russian financial sector. So similar to the EU and UK, but we saw on February 24th, the U.S. imposed blocking sanctions on VTB, Okerti, Novkin Bank, Sovcom Bank, and certain prominent Russian individuals. So when I say blocking sanctions, I mean U.S. persons are broadly prohibited from dealing with these banks absent a license. I mean, the government usually, in this case, has offered some limited wind down and general licenses. So, just to take an example, VTB, the restrictions enter into effect immediately, but there's some general licenses and wind downs, essentially allowing for orderly wind down of activities for 30 days. And so, yes, sanctions are imposed immediately with immediate effect, but OFAC has issued a number of other general licenses, which we can provide to you separately in our presentation. But also on February 24th, so the U.S. actually sanctioned Sberbank, which is Russia's largest bank. But what they did not say U.S. persons are broadly prohibited from dealing with Sberbank. They said basically U.S. banks are prohibited from opening and maintaining correspondent accounts and processing transactions with Sberbank and its subsidiaries. So it is a very severe sanction. It essentially cuts off any other bank from dealing in U.S. dollars with Sberbank, but does not broadly prohibit U.S. persons from dealing with Sberbank. And then we also have these, what we call less than blocking sanctions. These are more targeted dealings or prohibiting transactions in debt and equity, new debt and new equity of designated entities, not just banks, but also other state-owned enterprises. So these are, you can't deal in new debt of more than 14 days of certain Russian companies. So that involves extensions of credit, issuing invoices. It gets complicated, but just wanted to flag that, OFAC is really, not all of these companies in Russia are subject to the same sanctions. Some are more severe and full blocking, and some are more limited. And then more symbolically, OFAC designated President Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the prime minister or the foreign minister, as our EU and UK colleagues have described. The US and its allies agreed to remove certain of the bloc banks actually from the SWIFT network. And so the US does not have jurisdiction over SWIFT, but the action was taken with the US on board. There was actually some discussion in US Congress if SWIFT didn't take the actions that Congress should pass legislation to sanction SWIFT itself for not taking that action. But it didn't come to that. SWIFT, the US and EU agreed to basically de-SWIFT the banks that our EU and UK colleagues described earlier. And it's certainly possible that more of these banks could be de-SWIFTed. I'll just note that the ones that were de-SWIFTed were the same banks that, all of them were banks that the US has put on the SDN list. And so no US person can deal with those banks. And so the SWIFT delisting was just sort of the next level for those banks. And then importantly, the US actually prohibited US persons from engaging in transactions involving the Russian central bank. Not a full blocking, but essentially no US persons can deal with the central bank directly or indirectly. This is a very significant sanction, has wide-ranging effects. We also imposed blocking sanctions on the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the RDIF, similar to the EU, and also its CEO. And so just as a reminder, when the US imposes blocking sanctions, it doesn't just mean the listed entity US persons can't deal with, but anything that they own 50% or more of directly or indirectly, even if not listed. And so the RDIF designation was significant given its role globally. It's not just the RDIF that is blocked, but anything that it owns 50% or more of. And then it's just been continuing day by day. And I stress this just because it's just moving so quickly and we're trying to digest it. Last week, the US government imposed more blocking sanctions on prominent Russian elites, their family members, their financial networks, various Russian defense companies, certain Russian intelligence directed disinformation outlets. So we're seeing more the initial focus was on the Russian financial sector, the banks, right? So Russia's largest banks, but we're seeing a shift to the U.S. government targeting other types of Russian entities in different sectors. And then just a couple of days ago, a new executive order basically prohibiting U.S. persons from importing into the U.S. Russian origin petroleum and other petroleum-like products, new investment in the energy sector in the Russian Federation by a U.S. person, and certain facilitation of that new investment. So we're still digesting this new executive order, but certainly even for non-U.S. companies, a ban on new investment in the energy sector in Russia by U.S. persons is a very significant development, just because of the scope of how U.S. sanctions apply to U.S. persons worldwide. So if a U.S. person is working for an Israeli company, the sanctions apply to U.S. persons anywhere they are, even if they're not in the U.S. And so I just wanted to flag, so OFAC, the authority that imposes sanctions in the U.S., they issue FAQs. We've actually gotten over 1,000 FAQs now, not for this particular program. This is sort of how they issue guidance in real time before imposing regulations. But I wanted to flag this one for Israeli companies because it kind of gets into the secondary sanctions aspect. Like, why as an Israeli company should I care about these U.S. sanctions? So the question that was posed by the government is, do non-U.S. persons risk being sanctioned for engaging in activity with persons sanctioned? Basically, am I going to be sanctioned for dealing with VTB, as an example, a bank that's subject to U.S. blocking sanctions? And so OFAC has said they evaluate a range of factors when developing sanctions target. Under these EOs, OFAC can actually sanction non-U.S. companies for materially assisting or supporting an SDN. And so what that means is very discretionary. If I'm an Israeli company and I send $10 to VTB, that's probably not going to be something that the U.S. government cares about. But if I'm doing a multi-million-dollar transaction with VTB after the sanctions have been imposed, OFAC is definitely going to take a look at that. Obviously, with secondary sanctions, it gets diplomatic, and OFAC will engage with the counterpart governments if there's an issue in Israel. Otherwise, they look like this is something that needs to stop, and otherwise we'll think about imposing secondary sanctions. We see this a lot with China, with the UAE, with other less so Israel, but other countries whose companies are still dealing with sanctioned persons after the prohibition. And so OFAC has authority to designate anyone who what they call materially supports an SDN. But they've clarified that non-U.S. persons don't risk exposure for dealing with, if, as an example, Russian railways is subject to more limited debt and equity restrictions. Israeli companies with no U.S. nexus would have no sanctions exposure for dealing with a Russian company that's subject to more limited non-blocking sanctions. And then the authorities in the U.S. also prohibit any transaction that evades or avoids the prohibitions. But I think this last bullet is really, really important for Israeli companies to understand. OFAC has said they will not view as evading or avoiding efforts by non-U.S. persons to comply with sanctions by replacing sanctioned suppliers or service providers, including financial institutions, with non-sanctioned persons. So I think OFAC realizes that these are a lot of sanctions. If you are currently dealing with a sanctioned person, a VTB or VEB, like, we're not going to view a non-U.S. person evading or avoiding that by taking time to find another bank. And so I think a lot of the questions we've gotten from the audience is, what if I'm dealing with someone who's subject to U.S. sanctions and I have a U.S., what do I do? So there are wind down licenses, but OFAC is saying we will give you time to essentially find someone to swap in with the sanctioned party. So if it takes a couple of days, it may technically give you some exposure, but I think OFAC understands that it takes some time for non-U.S. persons to replace sanctioned suppliers, replace service providers. As we continue to impose sanctions on more and more Russian companies, it's just going to take more time to understand, am I dealing with someone who's subject to sanction, and can I actually take the time to find someone else to replace a non-sanctioned bank or a non-sanctioned person outside of Russia that can assist. And then quickly on Belarus, the U.S. has imposed a number of sanctions on Belarus, mostly list-based sanctions, targeting a number of Belarusian state-owned enterprises. Even before Belarus has been assisting Russia with the invasion in Ukraine. The U.S. has targeted the Lukashenko regime for years for sort of a wide range of human rights reasons and other, the migrant smuggling, so a wide range of conduct that the U.S. has targeted Belarus on. And then, recently, OFAC has actually imposed more sanctions on Belarus due to Belarus's support for the Russian invasion. They started to list defense and banking sector entities in Belarus. But this is an area that we definitely think we expect OFAC to target more, sort of trying to align Belarus sanctions with Russia sanctions. And on the export control side, which Kevin will get into, they've actually done a more comprehensive job of actually aligning Belarus and Russian measures. But with OFAC, we're not quite close to what they've done with Russia yet, but we're getting closer. And it's just something to monitor with respect to dealings with Belarusian entities if they're on the U.S. SDM list or otherwise. And then just quickly, before I turn it over to my colleague Kevin to discuss export controls, with respect to risk consideration, Israeli companies really need to be cognizant of any U.S. touch points to a transaction. I mentioned U.S. dollars; that's paramount. Any Israeli to Israeli transaction that involves U.S. dollars, theoretically and practically in some cases, U.S. government has taken the view that the U.S. dollar link alone is enough to assert primary sanctions jurisdiction over that transaction. And so, U.S. persons, U.S. origin goods, facilitation risks. If U.S. persons can't facilitate non-U.S. persons conduct, that would be prohibited from U.S. persons engaging themselves. So, if you have U.S. persons at your company, that they generally need to have a recusal policy if there are activities that they can't engage in themselves. I can't emphasize this enough. Screening all parties to your transaction. There are a number of third-party providers. We're happy to provide a list, but essentially is to assess ownership or control of sanctioned individuals or entities. As I mentioned, it's not just what's on the OFAC list, it's anything that these entities own by 50% or more of. So these screening providers in real time will update their repositories. So if you're dealing with a counterparty and you don't see them on a sanctions list, if you screen them, it'll tell you, look, this is 50% or more owned by a sanctioned person. And so you're actually, absent a license, prohibited from dealing with that person if there's a U.S. touch point. And so that's very, very important. The 50% rule is different than the EU-UK rules, which discuss ownership and control as our colleagues described. But the screening of all parties to your transaction in this current environment, particularly as they relate to Russia, is very, very important. And then just to emphasize, we're seeing the US, we're seeing the UK, we're seeing the EU, we're seeing Japan, New Zealand, so many different countries impose sanctions on Russia. They're not all the same. As I think you've seen from my presentation and the EU-UK presentation, there are differences. Differences in the listed entities, differences in the wind down licenses, differences in the scope of the carve-outs. So it's really important, to the extent you have U.S. persons and obviously EU and UK persons, but any persons who are resident in jurisdictions that have imposed sanctions on Russia. It's a very complicated time to be doing business with Russian entities, just because of the number of countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, and they're not all the same sanctions. And so if the U.S. has sanctioned a person or an entity, it doesn't mean that every other jurisdiction has done so. Location risk, just quickly flagging any dealings with the DNR and LNR regions of Ukraine. It's unlikely that most companies have business in these separatist regions. The restrictions do not target the entire oblasts, that they're more limited, but we could see as Putin expands his incursion into Ukraine, we could see the US actually expand this embargo to other territories or parts of Ukraine that Russia essentially claims for itself. So that's something that we're monitoring. The executive order actually already provides authority for the U.S. to expand the embargo beyond just the DNR and LNR regions. And then payments. We've gotten lots of questions about payments. Assess any dealings with Russian banks. So the U.S. has not targeted every single Russian bank yet, but they targeted the biggest one. So if you have dealings with VTB, Sberbank, VEB, Gazprom banks, the big Russian banks, it may not be prohibitive for you from dealing with those banks right now, just depending on the restrictions. But definitely want to take a closer look at what's possible. Can I find a non-sanctioned bank, whether it's in Russia or otherwise, just to swap in, just because of the risk of dealing with these Russian banks, not just for U.S. persons, but also for non-U.S. persons. And then contractual safeguards, including robust sanctions compliance language and all agreements and strong termination rights. The last point I'll just say is, I've covered a lot, and our EU and UK colleagues have covered a lot, but there's actually so much more that the US can do that it hasn't done with respect to Russia. And so, monitoring every day is very important. We haven't really targeted many other sectors besides the financial sector. We can increase sanctions on other types of entities right now. We can go after more oligarchs. The U.S. really has a lot more it can do. I mean, we've discussed the comprehensive embargo that the U.S. has in place on Iran, North Korea, other countries. It's possible that we're getting closer and closer to that with respect to Russia. It kind of depends on how the invasion continues in Ukraine, but we're seeing more and more sanctions on the U.S. side that, in the aggregate, are essentially getting closer and closer to a full blocking of the Russian government. And so we're not close to there yet, but given the pace of this, there's a lot more that the U.S. can do. So I just wanted to make sure you all understand that. We're happy to provide links to the relevant sanctions list, but this is very fast moving and really unprecedented in so many different ways. And so with that, I will transfer it over to my colleague, Kevin Wolf, who will discuss export controls. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'll be brief. Go to the next slide. So regulations, export controls are the regulations in the U.S. and Israel and many other countries that govern the export, re-export, and transfer of physical items, software, technology, and sometimes services to specific end uses, end users, and destinations to accomplish national security and foreign policy objectives. Historically, export controls with respect to their national security objectives have been focused on items that are either weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons, or the bespoke or dual-use items, the parts, components, software, and technology that are necessary for their production, development, or use. What makes the export controls involving Russia and Belarus, which are identical, different, is that their objective is to impose significant economic harm and pain on key sectors of the Russian economy. Basically, it's far broader than just items that have some relevance to a weapon, and far broader than items that are advanced. It's anything that Russia needs to keep its aerospace industry functioning, its computer industry functioning, its semiconductor industry functioning, telecommunications, lasers, sensors, navigation, avionics. Really the key sectors where Russia is dependent upon manufacturers outside the US, these controls are focused. Moreover, they are extremely coordinated. For the first time since the Cold War, the United States and about 30 other countries, the EU, the Five Eyes countries, Japan and Korea, have all agreed to impose the same licensing policies of denial for anything that's on any of the traditional export control lists, as well as imposing controls from export from their countries with respect to items that are not on any of the multilateral control lists, the lists of items that the 4 different export control regimes govern, but also items that historically only the United States has governed that are less sensitive items, aircraft parts, semiconductor components. With respect to companies outside of the United States, and Israel in particular, there are 3 things to keep in mind. These rules apply not only to exports from the United States, but they also apply to foreign-made items, non-US made items, in one of 3 ways. First, if the non-US made item contains more than 25% US origin content, that's somewhere identified on the Commerce Control List, which is this list of items the US regulates for exports. And it's far broader than the multilateral control lists. It includes, again, items like aircraft parts and significantly semiconductors. that the U.S. historically has only controlled. Second, using a tool that was created in August of 2020, the use of U.S. software or tools or equipment or technology to produce items that are described on the Commerce Control List is also subject now to U.S. licensing obligations if manufactured outside the United States and then sent to anybody in Russia for any reason. And so think about it, if you use a piece of U.S. production equipment for aircraft or a piece of U.S. semiconductor equipment, or even a non-U.S. piece of equipment that was produced itself with U.S. technology or U.S. software, that use of the equipment causes the wholly non-U.S. made commodity, like a semiconductor or an aircraft part or a ship part, to become subject to U.S. export controls if destined to Russia. Generally, licenses will be denied for such items unless it is associated with a reason associated with safety, such as safety of flight, or with respect to Israel, there are limited exceptions for transactions between companies that have affiliates in Russia involving allies such as Israel. So if you have a joint venture or a subsidiary that's associated with an Israeli company in Israel, it means that there's a possibility that a license could be granted so long as the export would not somehow benefit the Russian government or the Russian military. So the non-US company, the Israeli company, would need to submit a request to submit one of its items that it would want to export to Russia to the US Department of Commerce, and they would decide whether it would be approved. The third way in which a non-US made item can be subject to US export licensing requirements is if it's same thing, if it's produced with tools or equipment that are US origin that are on the list, or software technology, which is on this very long Commerce Control List. And the difference is if the destination is for a military end user that is identified on the entity list, and there are now 51 Russian and Belarusian entities, even if the output is a washing machine or a toothbrush, and you use US tools or software technology that are on this Commerce Control List, then that wholly non-sensitive, completely commercial item going from outside the United States to Russia for end use by one of these newly listed entities, or for incorporation into something that one of these entities has ordered, that is also subject to US export controls. And then if you have any US origin commodities, software, or technology which are described on this Commerce Control List, their shipment from outside of the United States to anybody in Russia for any reason is not controlled. Actually, the slides I see I haven't been saying to advance the slides. If you would go through a couple of slides right here, yeah. And so go on to the next page, who is affected, possible issues to spot, and then I'll just close with this. Go to the next slide. This is a good summary of applicable to almost any hardware, software, technology going to anyone in Russia, Belarus, or the occupied regions in Ukraine. So my last point will be critical to knowing whether non-US made items are subject to US export controls will be to have a good analysis and understanding of the classification status of your products, which is whether they are somehow described on the Commerce Control List, which is available on the Commerce Department website. And it's a very lengthy, complex list. If you are an export control person, the primary items that I'm referring to that are newly affected are items that are controlled for anti-terrorism reasons, which are historically the types of items that would have only required a license if destined to Iran or Syria or Cuba or North Korea or Crimea. And these are historically only controlled by the United States, but now are the types of items that can cause non-US made products to be subject to US export controls. So I will stop there and leave it open for questions. I sent around a client alert that describes everything that I said in much more detail.
Thank you very much, Kevin and Andrew. I'm sure, and of course before that, also to the EU presentations. This is a lot to digest. I'm sure all our audience are quite overwhelmed, as we are. And indeed, this is a complicated issue. So in any case, to say again that we will be sharing the presentations and the materials, and also as Ophir and Ohad mentioned in their opening words, that it is eventually every company needs to do its own analysis and due diligence and the specific case, including the supply chain and the know your customers aspects, etc. So it's indeed something that requires further work and not within the remit of this opportunity to answer specifically on every question, but we will try, of course, to refer to the questions that we received, or at least most of them. So let me take, perhaps I will read out like 2 or 3 questions at a time, and please, the panel, please feel free to respond to whatever you feel relevant. So, and perhaps something was already mentioned previously and answered. So the first question was regarding payments to Russian suppliers. What about cases where the Russian suppliers have bank accounts outside of Russia? Is that okay to pay to them? Will they get the money? That's one question. Then the second one is regarding receiving revenues. Transfers from Russian clients because of open debts and transactions, and what about cases where the actual selling and was done before the sanctions were issued and before this whole crisis? So that's the second question, and that's, let's stop there and I'll let you answer, and then we'll continue to the next questions.
I'm happy to have a first go from the EU perspective, at least. So if you're doing payments with Russian entities as a matter of and I'm speaking only about EU law, you're doing payments with Russian entities that go exclusively through banks that are not listed and outside of Russia, then there might not be necessarily a problem. One thing to always keep in mind, and this might be a point that we need to repeat also in respect of many of our responses, is that, of course, there'll be a lot of attention for the prohibition also to circumvent any of the sanctions. So it's sometimes a fine line between you kind of as Andrew also explained, the businesses will need time to redirect some of their supply chains to make alternative arrangements. But there is also a prohibition on circumventing the sanctions, and we'll have to see especially how the EU authorities will interpret that circumvention prohibition. Of course, as I think was covered in both presentations, if these are payments that are being made through banks outside Russia, but with a Russian entity, please do check if the Russian entity is not on a list or if it has any association whatsoever with any listed person or entity. So that's always kind of that check always needs to happen. And then in terms of from when do the sanctions apply? Well, all of the sanctions apply as soon as they are published, officially published in the EU. So for some of the new sanctions we mentioned regarding maritime navigation goods, for example, or the the new Belarus sanctions. They were published last night, so they already apply. But also, as was explained in the presentation of our US colleagues, there are, of course, various carve-outs and certain types of derogations that specify that, for example, if it's relating to a payment for a contract that was concluded before the imposition of the sanction, that often that, of course, can still be completed. And then you need to check what the specific dates are, cutoff dates that apply. And sometimes it's an actual carve-out, so you don't need to ask for a license. But in other instances, for certain sanctions, you would need to ask nonetheless for a license in order to secure the payment in respect of a past contract that was concluded. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would agree with Isabel from the U.S. side that there's no, as I mentioned, there's not a full prohibition on dealing with Russia. So it really depends on who your bank is, who your counterparties are. The screening I mentioned is just paramount, because it could be that you're dealing with a Russian bank that's not subject to sanctions yet, and so you could be fine. But if you're dealing with a VEB or a VTB, there's a wind down license, and so non-U.S. if a U.S. person can rely on a general license, OPEC has said non-U.S. persons do not risk exposure for something that a U.S. person can rely on a license with. So if you're dealing with VTB and a U.S. person would have 30 days to wind down, a non-U.S. person would also have 30 days to wind down, just to not have any secondary sanctions exposure. So unfortunately, I hate to say it depends, but it really depends on who your counterparty is. Is that counterparty listed? Is the bank listed? What restrictions is the bank subject to, right? Because if it's spare bank, and at least on the U.S. side, U.S. banks are prohibited from basically processing transactions involving spare bank. So you might have some logistical difficulties dealing with spare bank. You wouldn't necessarily be subject to exposure yourself, but it really just depends on the bank and the specific general license or wind down that is applicable to the counterparty. And so just to clarify, the U.S. is not saying you cannot do business with Russia yet, or we have not gotten to Iran, Cuba, North Korea. I think it's important to understand, because I'm sure many of you have touch points with different Russian customers and different suppliers and counterparties. Right now, it's targeting specific Russian entities and individuals. We're getting closer. We have the new investment ban on Russian energy sector, but that's in Russia. And so it's kind of like a slow creep that we're seeing every single day, more and more sanctions adding up, something that is getting closer to an embargo, but we're not really close to that yet. And so, yes, any touch points you have to Russia, you should assess to make sure that it's not a block person or otherwise subject to sanctions. But I just wanted to reiterate that not every company in Russia is subject to the U.S. sanctions yet.
Thank you very much. If there are no further responses to this, I will continue with the next questions. So I'll present, there are 3 questions relating in different ways to the same sector, which is software, and I'm sure, as you know, this is an important sector for Israel and Israel's international trade. So it's very important. So one question was regarding reselling software products developed in Russia. So basically importing and exporting. And then the second question regards the regulation or restrictions on buying, again, software or software services. And it says outsourcing from Russia. And then the third question, again, regarding outsourcing from Russian and Belarus IT companies, whether that would be restricted or not, or in what cases.
Okay, if you allow me, I will take this from the EU perspective. So concerning the resale of software products, I read developed in Russia. So in principle, in the EU, there is no export restriction as such applying. So an Israeli company can freely export software products to the EU. However, on the assumption that the resale of this software will be made in the EU, so there is a link with the EU, there might be a problem concerning the transfer of funds, especially where the company developing the software in Russia is in itself a listed entity. So should be careful. And the second scenario is the scenario where the company developing the software is not a designated entity. So it's not in the list, in the EU list, but is controlled by a listed person. So one of the shareholders, the main shareholder, is a listed person. In this case, there will be an indirect transfer of funds to a listed person, so covered by the EU sanctions, because under this scenario, basically the EU customer will transfer funds to the Israeli company, which in turn made a payment in favor of the Russian entity providing the software, so in exchange of the software. And all this transaction under EU law entails an indirect transfer of funds to a listed entity. So that could be a problem. Concerning the outsourcing, I would say no, because there is an export ban of software products from the EU to Russia. So I don't see any problem if an Israeli company would outsource or buy software products from Russia, for instance. I leave the floor to the US colleague.
Yeah, very, very quickly on the US side, there isn't a prohibition as such, assuming that it isn't produced or developed with US software or US technology or US tools like a computer, just coming from Russia to Israel back. So that's not an issue, but you would want to know whether any US origin software tools or technology was used to produce it. If so, even if Russian origin, it might get caught. Second, always comply with Israeli law, of course, whatever the Israeli rules are. And third, with respect to software as a service, no, the act from the US side of providing software as a service is not a controlled event, so long as it's not with one of the sanctioned individuals and a US person or US dollars involved under the sanctions. But from an export control perspective, it's not the service that would be controlled. It would be whether the technology that's generated from it was produced or developed using US tools, US technology, or US software, or otherwise affected by the scope of export controls.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So we have 3 more questions. So let's try to answer all of them. 2 questions which are the mirror of one of the other, but very much connected in regards to the EU. Do the EU sanctions apply to an Israeli subsidiary of a company registered in the EU? And then another question is about export from Israel to Russia of an Israeli company that has subsidiaries in the EU. So this is both about the touch points with the EU.
Thank you, Lena. So first of all, as we stated during the presentation, if it's an EU branch of an Israeli company, then the sanctions apply. But if it's an Israeli subsidiary of an EU registered company, so it's a company that is registered under Israeli law, in that situation, in principle, you don't have to comply with the sanctions. But you need to be careful because you might, because of the link with the parent company, you might have some EU nationals working in Israel in your company. And they, for example, might not be able to carry out certain transfers, for example, to certain banks. So they would need to you need to be careful what your EU employees might, what type of activities that they are carrying out in your business. Of course, because of your link with your EU parent company, you might also be doing some payments via EU banks, and you should take into account that those EU banks will need to comply with the sanctions. And then finally, wanting to watch out for, and as I already signaled in an earlier response, is to make sure that the EU parent company is not using necessarily the Israeli subsidiary to circumvent the EU sanctions. So that's something to be quite cautious. Then in terms of direct exports from Israel to Russia, as such, there is no problem. The export restrictions that the EU has applied apply from the movement of goods from the EU territory to Russia. But watch out, of course, if they are Israeli goods that you are exporting to Russia via the EU, then of course the export prohibitions are triggered. And here again, I would say in principle, okay, but check what are the links with your kind of EU parent company and to see if there's any risk of circumvention. Thank you.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions waiting, but I think our time is almost up, so we'll only take one. There was a very similar question regarding the US sanctions vis-a-vis an Israeli subsidiary of a company incorporated under US law. So if you could shortly...
Yeah, similar response. So the US parent, non-US sub situation is only directly under, as a matter of US law, is only an issue with respect to Iran and Cuba. And so right now, if you have a US parent and Israeli sub, no automatic sanctions in the Russia context, but as Isabel mentioned, there are a number of different ways where, if you have a US parent and Israeli sub, that OFAC could assert jurisdiction if the US parent is sort of facilitating or approving transactions of the Israeli sub and there are US persons involved. But technically, as a matter of law, that only comes up if it's in the Iran and Cuba context, in the US side.
Okay, so I think this is the time to wrap up, and I hope it was helpful. And thank you again very much. It was very, very extensive, and indeed we received a lot of information, and we will take some time to digest it. And of course, as all the speakers mentioned, these continue to be evolving, and we all need to continue following the developments and see what happens. So thank you very much. We will wish you all a very nice evening in Europe and a nice day in Washington. תודה רבה לכולם על ההשתתפות. אנחנו נפיץ את המידע ומאחלים לכולם ערב טוב. להתראות.